Hello, and this is the first lecture for week 7. It's entitled New Myths for a New Republic, and I'm going to be focusing on Phyllis Wheatley, Philip Freneau, and a little bit on the transitions into literature from 1820 to 1865. First, looking at Phyllis Wheatley, I hope you enjoy. You just get to read a little bit of her. There's a lot to read, but we're just focusing in on one very short poem because there is a lot to read coming out here. Hopefully you read the little biographical information about her. Really a remarkable person, a remarkable character. Brought from Africa at age 8, sold as a slave in Boston, incredibly intelligent. She is a gifted poet, obviously an intellectual, extremely important to the history of black literature, important to the history of women's literature. And her writing at first feels, in a lot of ways, like a parody of British writing at the time. I mean, if you study British literature at that time, Milton and Pope and those sorts of classically influenced writers of the time, she's writing very much in that style. But if you read her writing more closely, and that's the reason why I chose being brought from Africa to America, because it is so short and so concise, it contains such it's so compact and it contains so much tone in it that it really is quite remarkable. I mean, the main criticism of Phyllis Wheatley is that she allowed very little of her own personal voice to come through in her poetry, but really I think in that poem her personal voice does come through. While she seems to be fairly critical of Africa, referring to it as dark and that pagan land and criticizing paganism versus Christianity. She does seem to she does express pride in self, referring to herself as a member of that sable race, sable being a very positive description of black. She uses a very chiding tone towards her audience. Remember, Christians, that, blacks can enter heaven as well, can join that angelic train, especially when you consider that her audience is exclusively white, upper and upper middle class literate whites. So she is basically chiding them for thinking that she can't be as civilized or as Christian as they are. So really her voice does come through quite clearly, and just really quite a remarkable person. Secondly, I had you read a little bit of Philip Freneau, again, just one poem, because I think it is really his best poem and gives you really the best look at who he is and what he does. It's not typical of his writing. A lot of his poetry is much more political. He was heavily influenced by Thomas Paine and by philosophers. The Indian Burying Ground is much more naturalistic and in a lot of ways I think a lot more interesting and original than a lot of his other poetry. He is considered to be the best poet of that era, among those who are referred to as the Columbian poets like Barlow and Tyler. Indian Burying Ground is I think is a pretty cool poem. He really does sort of take these ideas, the sort of philosophical ideas from Jean Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the tabula rasa idea, the noble savage idea, and ground those along with the Native American myth into this sort of spiritual context, which is interesting coming from someone who is very much a deist, very much a lover of reason and rationalism. And you noticed in the very last passage, he capitalizes reason. For him, reason is godlike in a lot of ways. It's not the God, but it's godlike in a lot of ways. And he's saying that here, in the presence of the sort of magical setting of the Indian Burying Ground, that even he is moved to imagine the magic of this setting. And it really does, I think, this poem really sort of sets the stage for what is happening in American poetry, that there are new ideas coming in, there are new themes, there are new forms, and Phyllis Wheatley and Philip Freneau give us a hint of what's to come. In the little introductory section that you're supposed to read before getting into Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper, there's a lot of information, and a lot of that will come more into play when we read later authors like Hawthorne and Poe and Melville. But a few things I want you to keep in mind. The question of what is an American literature, the importance of creating a distinct American literature, the concept of literary nationalism, that it's important for a culture to own its literature, to have a distinctive literature that's original, that's specific to itself, that's identifiable, that's not just a copy of British literature or French literature. One of the aspects that I think is very interesting that's highlighted in that section is the economics of the literary art, and the fact that it's very difficult for an American author to make a living being an author, and thus the fact that people like Hawthorne and Melville have to seek out political patronage, and people like Poe end up dying in virtual poverty because they can't make a living with their art, and they struggle with that. There's also the fact that a lot of what was popular literature at that time has not really lasted, and that what was not popular is really the things like Poe and Hawthorne and Melville that we go back and read again and again and again. A lot of the great art of that time was really kind of not highlighted at that time, was not really respected. And I also want you to pay attention to the preview that you get of some of the authors that we're going to spend more time with as the semester rolls on. Irving and Cooper, Hawthorne, Poe and Melville, some of the greats.